Welcome to this night that we are calling Exploring the Resurrection. Did it really happen and does it really matter? And so a lot of times in churches, there is this assumption that you just kind of have to have blind faith, that you're just handed something. A preacher or a Sunday school teacher or whoever it is says, hey, here's what you got to believe, and you're just expected to kind of swallow it and take it in. And if you dare ask a question, then it means you don't have faith. And at CSF, we just we that's not who we are. That's not who we think God is. And so we think asking questions and bringing even our questions, our doubts, bringing those to God is part of what He invites us to do. And so we always want to deal openly and honestly with questions. And we're in the middle of a university campus where people are asking all sorts of tough and interesting questions, and people are using their minds in good ways. And we think at CSF that some of the best thinking on campus. I certainly hope in the physics department, chemistry department, philosophy department, English department, I hope there's good thinking going on in those places. But we think it's good thinking should be going on at CSF. We don't want to just be tadpoles, all heads, no body. We certainly want to love people well, but part of loving people well is using our minds well and thinking well. And so tonight we're going to think about the resurrection. Apostle Paul says that if the resurrection didn't happen, we Christians are to be most pitied because we've bet our life. We've stuck our lives on Jesus, and if the resurrection didn't happen, then it's all just a house of cards, and it all falls down. And so it is so key for us to get this straight. And we are honored tonight to have with us Mike Licona. Mike is a fantastic scholar. Mike's been at CSF before. We've loved having him here. Students have loved having him here. He's the author of a number of different books. A couple that I've got right here. One of the books he edited, wrote some of the essays in, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science, called Evidence for God. Another one of his key books that he's got here, The Resurrection of Jesus. We won't be going through all 800 and some pages of that tonight, but The Resurrection of Jesus. And, if you see, you get all the blurbs on the back. There are people from all over the country. Duke Divinity School's dean commenting on what a unique and powerful book this is. You got somebody from Princeton, William Lane Craig, one of the most famous Christian scholars alive, commenting that this is Craig Keener. I mean, so many different people saying Mike's book, his work on the resurrection, is so pivotal. Mike teaches at Houston Baptist University in Texas. Phenomenal scholar, great guy. We've loved having him here at CSF before. And so, Mike, I know we can't give you an applause, but we'd like to bring you on in here. So, Mike Licona, welcome.
Well, thanks for that warm introduction, Brian. It's just an honor to be with you guys again. I think your ministry is CSF. I say this with all sincerity. It is one of the most effective, organized campus, exciting campus ministries, one of the most that I've ever been to. So it's an honor to connect with you guys again.
Wow, man, we didn't even pay Mike for that. He didn't tell me he was going to say that, but
that's right.
We will take kind compliments, and we'll try to even believe those things. That's really
well. I'm really excited about what you guys are doing and for your new building coming up. And every time I've been there, I think I've been there 2 or 3 times with you guys, and it's just so exciting. One thing that's just stands out. It was either the last time I was there or the time before, and you were doing some baptisms there in the building. It was just so cool to see the excitement with the students, those getting baptized and those around. So, man, you guys are just great.
Well, that's a great segue because, oftentimes one of the mantras that we will use as we baptize people, there is this, we talk about death, burial, as you bury someone in the waters and they're resurrected into new life in Jesus. And so we use that word resurrection. I know that word it's Easter this weekend. And so talking about the resurrection, let's start there. When we talk about the resurrection, what does that term mean? As a Christian, from Mike's background, Mike is we were talking about, he's kind of this genre blurring kind of guy. He's a historian, deals with philosophy, history, kind of brings together a lot of different disciplines, New Testament studies, but when we talk about that term resurrection, Mike, as a Christian, we say that Jesus rose from the dead. Let's just make sure that we're clear on that. What does that term mean, that Jesus, when we say Jesus rose from the dead, he resurrected, what do you take that to mean?
Well, the term literally means to stand up, to rise up. And it doesn't necessarily, the term in Greek doesn't necessarily have to mean coming back from the dead, but it's all within context, right? So it's all, we have the same stuff in English, that words can mean different things in different contexts. Certainly when Jews of that period spoke of resurrection, they're talking about a corpse returning to life. And the early Christians did too. Our earliest Christian author to our knowledge would be Paul. And when he talks about resurrection, he says that our resurrection will be like Jesus's resurrection. That's 1 Corinthians 15. And then he goes on to describe what our resurrection is going to be like. And in several different texts, he talks about it being a bodily, physical resurrection. And so if we're going to be raised physically, bodily on the last day, then that means Jesus was raised physically, bodily in the first century.
So yeah, so this is not just myth, right? This is where you would distinguish, the Bible and its claims about Jesus rising from the dead. This is very different than some of the other stories that we have of this or that person, this or that God, a religious figure, from any number of different resurrection narratives we might have from other religions. This is unique in that way. Would you say? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are accounts of other Greek heroes and others who are said to have come back from the dead, but Jesus is unique in a sense that most of these others, at least within the Near Eastern Mediterranean religions and stories, these were connected to the agricultural cycles. So, when I was a kid, and I'd saw lightning and heard the thunder, I'd say to my mom, well, what is that? She said, well, the angels are bowling in heaven. Well, in antiquity, you'd have a drought, a period of drought. And then after that, it would be, there'd be the rainy season. And that would be explained through a god dying and then rising from the dead. So it was tied to the agricultural cycles. Well, and it was about pretty much a fictional character, but who was situated in the gray and distant past. And of course, you had the drought seasons and then the rainy seasons every year. So this wasn't necessarily regarded as something that needed to be true. The Christians, on the other hand, it's not tied to the agricultural cycles. It was a unique event. It only happened once with Jesus' death and then his resurrection. And then you've got the Apostle Paul arguing in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised, our faith is worthless. So basically his argument is, if you look through the whole chapter, if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, this life is all there is, and the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. And Paul is saying this without getting into all the details. He's saying, if Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised, then, why are we suffering and persecution to the point of possibly being killed on a daily basis? Why do we do that if Christ was not raised? So his argument makes no sense unless Paul and the apostles meant that Jesus was raised in a historical sense. It really happened according to them.
Well, Mike, I hear you referencing Paul and this sorts of things. And, a lot of people would point back to the Bible and just say, well, you're again, just kind of telling me, well, the Bible says it, Paul says it, Jesus rose from the dead. But, as someone who has, you have a PhD, you've got, all kinds of, academic credentials, these sorts of things. What if I'm a thoughtful person and I go, well, I don't know. I don't want to just believe this simply because someone told me or a book tells me to believe it. As someone who deals in history, philosophy of history, all these different disciplines, what are some of the best reasons for believing in the resurrection outside of, well, the Bible just tells you, therefore you ought to believe it? So what would you say are some of the best arguments out there for believing in the resurrection?
Well, first, let me say, I'm not a Muslim, I'm Christian. I don't believe the Quran has any connections whatsoever to being divine revelation. However, as a historian, a student of history, I can read the Quran and I can learn certain things. So when the Quran says, God is talking to Jesus and he says, did you say that you, me, and Mary are all gods? And Jesus says, far be it from me. I never said that. I've only said we are servants, serve God. Well, I don't believe, again, I don't believe that that conversation ever took place, but what it tells me as a student of history is that Muslims in the early 7th century were saying that Jesus and Mary are not gods. First of all, they were misunderstanding, misreading the Catholic thoughts about, the high view of Mary there. So they weren't grasping their view of Mary correctly. But then it's informing us that Muslims were saying that Jesus is not God. All right, at minimum. Or in Surah 4, verses 157 and 158, when it says that Jesus did not die, the Jews thought that they killed him, that God made it appear as though he died. It's a no-brainer here. You don't have to be a scholar to recognize that Muslims in the 7th century were saying Jesus did not die by crucifixion. And if he didn't die by crucifixion, of course, he didn't rise from the dead, right? So I don't have to believe the Quran is divinely inspired. I don't have to believe it's generally reliable. I can approach it as a student of history, and I can mine from it a collection of facts that I can know about the period. Non-believing scholars come to the Gospels or the New Testament, the Bible, in the same way. They can say, okay, well, we know that the earliest Christians were saying that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. We know that Christians who wrote the Gospels, and we know that Paul really believed that Jesus was God in the flesh. But then a historian can go even further, and they would apply the same kind of things that you do if you were a general historian operating outside the community of biblical scholars. You would use common sense principles, such as we're going to put a greater amount of weight on eyewitnesses. We're going to put a greater amount of weight on testimonies that are close to the events they purport to describe. We're going to assess the data and give it more weight if it's attested by more than one independent sources. What about if there are unsympathetic sources that attest to these? Like what if there's a non-Christian source that says that Jesus was executed by the Romans? Well, that's going to account, pretty well too. So, we look at these kinds of things and we can verify a number of things about Jesus just using the Christian literature, maybe a few non-Christian sources, but especially the Christian literature, the early New Testament literature. And just in closing, I'd say Bart Ehrman, a friend of mine, who is, he vacillates between being an atheist and an agnostic, but even he says the best sources on Jesus are the New Testament Gospels. And he says, this is not for theological reasons. It is for historical reasons, pure and simple. And that's a virtual quote.
You are saying then that some of the reasons that we have to believe in this, some of the evidence you're citing there, or the ways in which we learn things about Jesus, this isn't just people of faith. These are just arguments from history that any good scholar doing their homework would come to. And so again, run through those again. What you would say is these are the things that we would know about Jesus and the resurrection. I just want to, in a very tight way, the things we could know just approaching this subject. We may not be able to know everything, but what are some of the key things that we would know just as a clear and a good student of history
about Jesus, period?
Yeah, about Jesus, and in particular as it relates to the resurrection.
Okay. Well, in particular about the resurrection, I'd say that the overwhelming majority of scholars today, including, so we're talking about a heterogeneous consensus of scholars, all right, nearly 100%, and from all different backgrounds, they would agree that Jesus died by crucifixion in the 1st century on the orders of Pontius Pilate, probably between the years 30 and 33, one or the other usually. They would agree that it was at the instigation of the Jewish leadership of that time that Pilate crucified Jesus. They would agree he died as a result. They would agree that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences that convinced them Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. They would agree that there was a persecutor of the church named Paul, who likewise had an experience while he was persecuting Christians, an enemy of Christ, that he had an experience he likewise interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him, and it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, these things I've just mentioned, this is something that virtually 100% of all scholars in the relevant fields, history, theology, New Testament, um, that whether they're atheist, agnostic, liberal, conservative, moderate, Christian, Jewish, they all agree on these things. All right. So you can take those, and then you can take some other things that are not agreed on by 100%, but a very high percentage. Things such as Jesus' brother James was a non-believer all the way up until the time Jesus was crucified. Same thing with his brothers. And then shortly thereafter, we find Jesus' brother James become a Christian. He becomes head of the Jerusalem church for a period, and then he's even martyred because he refused to deny that his brother is the Messiah. You also have things such as Jesus' appearances were not only to individuals, but likewise to groups. Probably about somewhere between 80 to 85, maybe even as high as 90% of scholars who opine on this would say that groups had certain kinds of experiences that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus to them. So what the task of the historian is, Brian, is to formulate a number of hypotheses that attempt to explain these facts. And then you compare these hypotheses, assess them for which one best explains the facts. And when you do that, there's only one that comes out that can explain all of them adequately, and that's the resurrection hypothesis.
So you would say then, I mean, if I'm hearing you right, and I didn't hear you quite say this phrase, but I'm curious if you would, what you think about a phrase like, a cumulative case argument, or a historical probability of, as you wrap all these different pieces of evidence together, one standing by itself may not push you to the resurrection, but you start to lump all those in together, and you really start to get, a picture that man, this seems like, there might be other possible explanations, but the most probable explanation seems to be that Jesus rose from the dead. Is that the type of case you're building?
Yeah, we wouldn't call that cumulative, because all historical investigation would do that. Like if you were going to say, how do we know the Holocaust occurred? Well, you wouldn't just isolate each fact like, oh, well, we had someone who claimed to have been in a concentration camp, and say, well, that alone has to account for it. Okay, no, we've got a guard, a Nazi guard who said he was a guard at the camp. We're not going to rely on just that one bit of information, or testimonies about Hitler and Himmler and what they set up. No, you're going to look at all the data, and that's when you form hypotheses. It's kind of like going into a doctor's office. You say, well, I've got a fever. Well, he's not going to, he or she is not going to diagnose you at that point as having coronavirus, or just having the flu, or having an infection, because there could be any number of things that could explain why you have a fever. They're going to look, okay, well, give me some of your other symptoms, and then you take all the symptoms, and then you come up with a diagnosis. There might be a number of diagnoses that one could think about, but there's probably going to be one diagnosis that best explains all of those data. And that's what historians do.
When one of the most popular hypotheses that's been put out there by a number of people, and probably a lot of just your average person on the street, might look at the resurrection and just say, what, the disciples just made this stuff up. That that their leader had been killed, they wanted to save face, and so they kind of glorified him and the things he had done, and they just kind of made up this story that Jesus rose from the dead. The Romans didn't really get him. I mean, obviously you've heard that objection raised before. When people raise that, and I think it's a fairly common objection, or even if it's not an objection, just kind of a background thought, people just exaggerated, the disciples made this up. How do you respond to that type of way of thinking?
Yeah, that's an easy one. Well, we have no less than 11.
I'm glad you think it's easy there, Mike. That's
Yeah, we have no less than 11 ancient sources that report that these disciples were willing to suffer continuously for their gospel proclamation. In fact, even some of them died as kind of brutal deaths as martyrs for their gospel proclamation. In fact, we've got reports about all of them dying but some of those reports are quite late. We can at least say Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, and probably even a few others, but they're not going to be as certain. They're going to decrease in historical confidence we can have in those things. But we can establish that they were all willing to suffer continuously, and that they all did suffer great persecution for their gospel proclamation. Now, that doesn't prove that what they were saying is true, but it strongly suggests that they believed what they were saying is true. So, for example, a Muslim, a jihadist who is willing to give up his or her life in the cause of Islam, just because they're willing to do that doesn't mean that Islam is true, but it does strongly suggest that they believe, they're convinced that Islam is true. The same thing about Christian martyrs killed by those jihadis. And we've seen pictures of those, of ISIS and some of these Al-Qaeda martyring Christians. Just because they're willing to go to their deaths doesn't mean that what these Christians believe is true. But it does strongly suggest that they sincerely believe what they believe is true. Liars make poor martyrs, right? So the fact that all of the disciples were willing to suffer persecutions continuously and willing to die for their gospel proclamation shows that they sincerely regarded what they were proclaiming about the resurrection as true.
Yeah.
So we can establish that the disciples were not only proclaiming Jesus was alive, had risen from the dead and was alive and had appeared to them, they actually believed it. And because the evidence is so good for this, you'd be very hard pressed to find a scholar within the last 50 years who has studied this stuff, even a skeptical one, who would suggest that the disciples lied about it. And that's why when like James Tabor and Simcha Jakubowicz, and they came out with the thing about the Talpiot tomb, the family tomb of Jesus a few years ago, the first thing, and then saying, yeah, this is where Jesus is buried, his disciples, his family put him in this tomb. I thought, well, that's easily refuted, because it's indisputable that these disciples not only claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them, they really believed it. And if they had reburied him in a family tomb, well, they couldn't believe he'd been raised from the dead. And it turns out that this thing, even though there was a Talpiot tomb, the chances of that being the tomb of Jesus are next to zero.
Yeah, yeah. Mike, so you've got, that's one, you hear lots of different theories about this. I mean, obviously the disciples made it up. There is the theory, the famous, well-known swoon theory that Jesus really didn't die on the cross. He it looked like he was dead. They took him down, but, we don't have any. Is there a single testimony in the ancient world of anyone surviving a Roman crucifixion? I mean, the Romans were professional killers, right? I mean, the swoon theory seems to me one of the easier ones, that Jesus didn't really die, seems to be fairly easily dismissed. Is that, would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's hardly anyone. In fact, in my research on it, I only found, I think, I don't know, maybe just a handful of scholars, and only one bona fide scholar in the relevant field who would suggest that Jesus may have or did survive his crucifixion. It was Barbara Teering, and a lot of people just don't take her seriously. She's one that says that Jesus survived and married Mary Magdalene, and they went to France or Germany, one of those places, and lived out their lives there.
Martin Scorsese may have believed her.
Yeah. It's like, well, they used, herbs and stuff to heal him in the tomb. Well, if that's the case, why aren't we using these today and go to the hospitals with burn victims and crash, automobile accident victims? I mean, if you can really recover from using aloe and frankincense and these things, let's bring them into the hospital, but hardly anyone would say that today. I think Teering's the only scholar in the relevant field who would say that actually happened. So, yeah, in answer to your first question, is there any reports in antiquity of someone surviving crucifixion? The answer is yes. There's only one, though, and it's Josephus. And he was talking about that during the Jewish war that was going on right before the temple was destroyed in the year 70. He said that he came across 3 of his friends who had been crucified. And so he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, who would later become the emperor. went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and as a favor, he asked that his 3 friends be saved. And Titus, out of a favor to Josephus, ordered that all 3 be removed from the crosses and provided the best medical care that Rome could offer at that point. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So even if Jesus had been removed from his cross prematurely and medically assisted, his chances of survival were still quite small. But
go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, to compound that, there's no evidence that Jesus was removed from his cross or that he was provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. So, if you're an internet blogger, you are welcome to posit anything you want online, because the only thing you need to do to posit something on the internet is you have to be able to breathe and have an internet connection. That's it. You don't even have to type because there's speech recognition software. But if you're a historian, then you've got to go with the evidence. And we've got a lot of evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. And so given all the evidence we do have for that, without any good evidence to the contrary, the historian at least has to conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him.
Mike, I've just got 1 or 2 final questions. Then we've got a few people who are going to ask questions. I think we've got a moderator who's going to bring some people even up on the screen here, and we've got some that are being typed in. And so, but I brought up a couple of difficult questions here, and I know, knowing a little bit about your story, and I want to get to your story in just a second before I ask, but I want to ask this question first. I know even from your story when you're writing your PhD and doing the research for this, that one that became your Resurrection of Jesus book was largely some of your doctoral work. Is that right?
It is. Yeah. It's a slightly revised version of my dissertation.
Yeah. And so, and I know that, I remember hearing you tell the story once when you're at CSF and you were like, hey, I'm in bed at night. And your wife said, you're struggling with doubts, aren't you? Yeah. And you're in the middle of writing a dissertation on trying to wrestle with the resurrection. And I love that piece. And I love that personal note about you. One, it just makes you human to go, hey, if Mike Licona can wrestle with this stuff and wrestle with some doubts at points, then maybe it doesn't mean my faith is lost. But I love that it also says that, hey, you were really trying to take the arguments seriously and not just dismiss them and say, I really want to wrestle with these. And if they're right, then Paul's right. I don't need to believe this. But so when you deal with difficult questions, what for you is then I want to switch just a little more personal note and then give time for a few questions from students who are here and others who are joining us. But for you, what do you think is the most difficult question, and how do you respond to it?
When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, Brian, I've been doing this for a while, and I just don't think that skeptics have any good objections to it. If I were going to go the skeptical route, I would just say, I just don't think there's enough evidence to persuade me to move in that direction. And I try to be honest with this stuff, like you mentioned about the doubting and things. And I have to admit, I loved my dad. He was a good guy, a real good guy, but he never understood me, how I'm wired, that I got to know truth and I second guess everything. It's just the way I'm wired. I don't like that about myself. It's an idiosyncrasy. That's the way I am. I doubt a lot of things. So and the way I put it with doubt, if I can just go, can I go off track just for a second here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I thought of this once, and I think people can connect with this. If I'm on a stage, and a lot of times when I'm lecturing on a stage at a conference or something, they'll have the stage marked off with little glowing, like masking tape. I don't know what it's called, but they say, don't go past this because the lighting isn't good past this. So, and it's usually, I've got maybe 10 feet from front to back and maybe 30 to 40 feet, from end to end. And, that's easy. I can do that. I could do cartwheels. I could walk backward. I could run backward. I could run backward with my eyes closed and never leave that space. But you take that same kind of thing and form a plank that's maybe 10 feet wide and, I don't know, 100 yards long, and suspended between 2 skyscrapers 1,000 feet above the ground, and say, okay, now I want you to walk across that. Well, it's going to worry me. I'm not going to want to do it. And it's not because I can't do it. Of course I could do it. It'd be easy to do, but why wouldn't I want to do it? Why wouldn't anyone in the right mind want to do it? Because we would be thinking to ourselves, well, what if? What if I can't? What if I fall? and the consequences are so horrible that we wouldn't even want to try it. And it's the same thing. The thing that gives me emotional doubt is I look at all the evidence and I say, the evidence is really good for Christianity, but what if I'm wrong? The consequences could be really terrible if God exists and it's not the Christian God. So that's the kind of stuff that causes doubt. That's the kind of stuff that kept me up at night. So the best refutation, or I'd say reason for not believing the resurrection, would be an emotional one that would say, I just don't want to be a Christian. It's kind of like this. I don't really care for Islam, to be honest with you. I'm not attracted to it at all, from what I see from a lot of Islam, from what I read in the Muslim literature, the early Muslim literature, and about the life of Muhammad. It doesn't attract me at all. So the question I've asked myself at times is, what if we didn't have this really good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? But what if Muslims had evidence as good as we have for the resurrection of Jesus that supported their worldview? Would it be enough to convince me to become a Muslim? And to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that question. I guess I'd have to look and see what kind, hypothesize what kind of evidence that would be. But it makes me think, if I'm a non-believer, I can look historically and say, yep, it points there to the resurrection. But then a person could say, yeah, it does, but historians have been wrong on things in the past. Sometimes we come across new data, like maybe we'll discover the corpse of Jesus in an ossuary someday. That's irrefutable. Irrefutably his. That kind of thing right there, is the evidence we have enough to convince someone who doesn't want to be a Christian to become a Christian? And I don't know the answer to that.
That's good. I appreciate your honesty. That's why I wanted to just give you a chance to just sound off on that, because I just appreciate the way, and that's why one of the things as I've known, several academics throughout my life, and have several friends who are professors. I really appreciate just your honesty in dealing with questions, Mike. It's one of the reasons we've had you around CSF, because I just love your open-heartedness. But speaking of CSF, we got a few questions. I think we got a moderator here who maybe going to switch us to those.
I'm pulling up my pal Landon. He's got a question for you. He typed it in, but Landon, here you go.
Hey.
Sorry. There we go. Should be hopping in just a second.
I see him. Hey, Landon. You got his microphone off.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to ask you on a personal note, what made you decide to focus your work on the resurrection as opposed to another part of Jesus's life? What really drew you to this part of the Jesus story?
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
So I was in my last semester of graduate school in the fall of 1985, and I was just really into studying the New Testament in its original language, Greek. I took as many courses in grad school as I could. I have the equivalent of 5 years of graduate level in Greek. And so I just love reading the New Testament in its original language. And I was, praying an hour to 2 hours a day. So I felt like I had a really good relationship with Christ. And one day it just started to eat at me. How do I know that I haven't deceived myself? I believe I've had answers to prayer and sensed God's presence and really getting a lot out of Scripture. But if Scripture isn't true, I don't care to read it in any language. And, if I'd been born in Afghanistan, would I be a Muslim? India, I'd be a Hindu. China, I'd be an atheist. Christianity was really the only religion that I'd been exposed to. So how do I know it's true? And that just really started to eat away at me my last semester in grad school. And I had a roommate who was doing a master's degree in Christian apologetics. And up until that point, I just had no use for Christian apologetics. They'd study things like David Hume and how to answer his arguments of naturalism. And I thought, when did Hume live? Well, back in the late 18th century. Well, why are you just getting around to answering this guy 200 years later? I mean, he's not around now. Who cares what he thought, And so I had no use for apologetics until I needed it. And he suggested I go see Gary Habermas. So I did. And I said, how do I know Christianity is really true? And he pointed me to the resurrection. And it's like within 20 minutes, I forgot if 15 minutes to half an hour, he's going over stuff about resurrection. And it made sense. Now, years later, I got thinking, well, I believed it real quickly because that's what I wanted to believe. I wasn't really after, I just wanted reasons to believe. I wasn't like really open-minded at that point. But then my second guessing and doubts got the best of me. And that's when I started to really get into looking at this as objectively as I could. And I built up 6 different steps that I could take to manage my own personal biases as my investigation proceeded. I tried to do it as objectively as I could. And nobody's 100% objective, nobody. But I really sought it because I thought, I don't have anything to fear with the truth. If Christianity is false, I'd want to know it, right? You bet. Because the thing that bothered me most was that my biases would get in the way of discovering truth, and it would cost me eternity. And that haunted me. So, but I realized at this point that Jesus and Paul were, they all built the truth of Christianity on the resurrection. Jesus said, destroy this temple, his body, and in 3 days he'd raise it. That's the evidence that he gave. You've got Paul saying, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. So I figured, look, if Jesus rose from the dead, I could know Christianity's true, and the others are not, other religions.
Yeah.
If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then I could at least scratch Christianity off my list and go on to the next worldview to investigate it. So that's what got me interested in resurrection.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Landon, for asking that. Dylan, do we have, getting a few texts here, some questions, seeing some on our chat screen here. Anybody else, any live ones, or do we want to read one?
Let's read one. I've got a few questions on my phone too, but let's read one.
Yeah, Mike, one that I've gotten here from, and I think you touched on this earlier, you might just want to re-hit it here in a quick 90-second answer or so, but since someone asked it, I want to pass along. It says, someone texted in, what differentiates the apostles from other religious leaders? I mean, other people have thought Muhammad or whatever was God's ultimate ultimate religious leader. So what differentiates the apostles from other religious leaders is the question that someone texted in here.
Well, it's a good question. I think you're not looking at the apostles versus Muhammad. You'd be looking at, because he's the leader of the movement, just as Jesus was the leader of the movement. Okay. So, it could be possible. You'd look and you say the leader, and Joseph Smith was a leader of a movement. Gandhi was a leader of a movement. You could look at leaders of movements and try to assess whether they were sane. David Koresh was the leader of a movement. Jim Jones was the leader of a movement. But then their followers, you'd say, well, what's the difference between those followers? Jim Jones' followers, David Koresh's followers, Muhammad's followers, Jesus's followers, his disciples. Jesus' disciples were certainly willing to die for the message about Jesus. So were Muhammad's followers. So what's the difference? Muhammad's followers died for what they believed was true, because they were believing that based on the testimony of Muhammad. Okay. But for all they would know, Muhammad could be a false prophet. They'd never know it because they didn't have the angel Gabriel giving to them revelations, as Muhammad said Gabriel was given to him. So they couldn't know whether Muhammad was a deceiver or a lunatic or whatever. But they died for what they believed is true. The disciples was different. They said that Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them. So they either knew that was false or they believed it was true. All right. So what would it, they're not going to die, all of them, or not going to subject themselves to constant persecution for something they know is false. Not all of them. Maybe a few of them would, but not all of them. But what convinced them that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them? We know that they were sincere in their beliefs. Something happened. What is it that happened? when it comes to Joseph Smith and Mormonism, he had 11 witnesses to the golden plates from which it said that Smith translated the Book of Mormon. But after Smith died, 8 of the 11 left Mormonism, and the only 3 that remained were family members. So that's different than what we have, them willing to go to their deaths for this stuff.
Mm.
So there is a difference between the followers of Jesus and the disciples, the original disciples, that is, and people who are original disciples of these different leaders.
That's great. Dylan, let's ask 1 or 2 more questions here, and we'll give Mike a chance to wrap us up with just maybe a personal reflection on the resurrection. So, Dylan, you mentioned you had 1 or 2 more there.
Yeah, I'm bringing on Jenny Asher, who's a student with us, and she's going to be coming on as a panelist in just a second. But here's a little softball one while we're waiting. Derek King, our pal Derek, who's getting the PhD, asked, history nerd questions. Scholars usually think Jesus died on 30 AD or 33 AD. Why one or the other? Why not 31 or 32?
I've never really looked at that, so I can't answer it. Most do think 30 or 33, like Derek says. I'd say there's just a ever slight majority that would go with 30. I tend to go to 33 and I could be wrong on this, but there's a real interesting thing. There was a guy named Sejanus who was like the right-hand guy for the Emperor Tiberius. And back then, if you were in politics, you usually have what was called a patron, someone who would kind of mentor you and kind of, promote you so that you'd become, move up the ladder, the political ladder. And Sejanus had a patron. His name was Pontius Pilate. Now, later on, Sejanus, he had so much power. And in fact, when Tiberius was hiding on an island, just neglecting all of his responsibilities of Rome, you have Sejanus was called the master of the horse, which was the second in command. And he was calling all the shots for Rome. Well, some who were jealous of him were putting rumors in Tiberius's head that he was planning to usurp and take control of Rome. And so Tiberius had him executed. So I don't know what year it was. I forgot. It was like 31 or 32, something like that. So now keep that in mind. We come to the account, I think it's in John, when Jesus is before Pilate and Pilate wants to let him go. And then the Jews say to him, "If you let him go, you are no friend of Caesar." Now that makes and Pilate feared when they said that. That makes a whole lot of sense if the crucifixion was in 33, shortly after Sejanus was executed by Tiberius, because Pilate knows, since he was a patron of Sejanus, that if report got back that he wasn't completely loyal to Tiberius, it might be his head on the block the next time. Mm. And so that would make sense of why Pilate crucified Jesus. And all debate was pretty much over once they said, "If you let him go, you are no friend of Caesar." Mm. So that's why I favor 33. I've never heard that argument given by someone, but that dawned on me just several years ago. And I thought, yeah, but I could be wrong.
Jenny, go ahead. We'll give you, and then I've got a couple other people. Then we're going to do a quick lightning round, because now I think people are like, "Oh, I want to get in my questions." So we're going to do a lightning round. We're going to give you about 60 seconds on about 3 last questions. I've gotten 3 or 4 good questions, and I want you to at least give us a quick snippet. But Jenny, go ahead and answer your question before we go to a lightning round.
Okay, this may not be quick, but I just wanted to know kind of what your research looked like when you were starting this. How do you know what sources are credible, and kind of what do you look for when you are doing this, and where do you find your sources, I guess?
Yeah, well, I was already familiar with some scholarly sources, so I started with those. You look in the bibliographies of those scholars, of the scholarly sources, the books, the journal articles, and you see which one of those might be relevant to your study, and then you get a hold of those. You get the books through interlibrary loan or whatever, or you purchase those books. Then I used something called New Testament Abstracts, and that's a database of virtually everything that's been written on the New Testament since, I think, 1985. journal articles, books, things like that. And so you have to subscribe to it, which I did. And then you enter certain key terms like resurrection, empty tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, burial of Jesus, appearances of Jesus, crucifixion, anything that's going to be related to the study. And, then it takes you to an abstract, all these sources that are listed since 1985 in all these different languages. Most are academic stuff is in English today, though. Even though you'll have some in German or French, most by far is in English today. So what I did was I look at this and you go down the list and it gives you the bibliographic information of the book and then a 1-paragraph abstract of what the book or journal article says. And so I'd copy all of those, and I came to over 260 pages of references, just maybe 30 per page. It was a lot. And then I went and I read all the abstracts, and then I'd cancel off all those that weren't, and copied and pasted into a document all that were relevant. And then I divided those. If it was something on the empty tomb, I pasted all those in a Word document on the empty tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, I did it on that. Appearances here, crucifixion here, things like this. Paul here, hallucinations this, visions this, apparent death this, whatever, and then I'd go through those. I'd get the sources and I'd read those sources. I mean, there were a lot of sources, things I read, and then I'd take notes, and then I'd highlight things, and then I'd copy or write those notes out on documents. I mean, it was a really tedious thing, but that's why the book ended up so long. That's how my process of research went.
Yeah, well, Mike, and I love the quality of research. Your book on the ancient biographies of Jesus. Remind me of the title.
Why are there differences in the Gospels?
Why are there differences in the Gospels? And one of the things people like to point out, well, this story says this story says that. And I love your research for the book. Mike and I were talking about this even earlier. He took 150 years on either side of Jesus, 150 years before Jesus, 150 years after Jesus, and read every ancient biography that we have. And then, I remember you said you went through and read the biographies of Jesus, the New Testament biographies, 8 different times in Greek, and looked for all the different literary and basically trying to understand the biographies of Jesus in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as these ancient sources. And so I love your work on recent stuff, recent scholarship, but you're also delving into ancient sources as well. It's one of the things I think makes you such a great scholar. But I want to so we're going to do a lightning round here because I've got a few really good questions. And so I'll give you 60 seconds on each of these. But here's one question from, actually, we got an attorney here who's watching here. And he texted me this, said, was there any worldly benefit of any kind of the disciples because of their account of the resurrection? Was there anything in a worldly sense that would have benefited them?
I guess you could have said, since they had known Jesus and there were a lot of people who liked Jesus, that they held a position of prestige, amongst some people. These were, when we say fishermen or things like that, that wasn't the low, these were like probably the top 10% wage earners back then. It said that the Zebedee, the father of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, he had people, workers who were helping. So, I mean, he had a business. So these weren't necessarily poor people. They're not going to be as affluent as we are today, but they weren't necessarily poor for their age, but, they would have a position of prestige. Now, whether that was worth it to them, to go through all the kind of persecution that they would do is a different question. And Paul left a really good lifestyle as a person and was a persecutor and became the persecuted because he believed he saw Jesus.
Yeah, it certainly seems like on the balance of things, they probably they got a lot of trouble. If they made this stuff up, they took on a lot of trouble, including, apparently even death and torture.
Yeah, it wasn't a good benefits package for sure.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a couple of questions from a couple of students here. Riley wants to ask. She says, "Hi, Dr. Licona. Have there been any interesting archaeological discoveries to support the resurrection? For example, how do we know the Garden Tomb is where Jesus was buried?"
Well, the Garden Tomb is probably not where he was buried. I've been to Israel twice. I've been to the Garden Tomb and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre twice. And by far, most scholars, almost all of them today, think the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was probably the actual tomb of Jesus, although you can't prove it with absolute certainty, of course, but they think it probably was his tomb. I'm not sure of all the reasons for why, but they do have their reasons why they think that that is the actual tomb of Jesus.
Secular history, does it give us any help towards the resurrection of Jesus outside of the Bible? Are there any secular accounts that help us, maybe not prove it, but help point us towards the resurrection of Jesus?
I'd say there are two. The first would be Josephus in a disputed passage in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, section 3, I believe it is. And he talks about how there was a man named Jesus. He had both Jews and Gentiles following him. He performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, Pilate crucified him. Now, it says some other things in there that most scholars do believe were later added by a Christian in the 2nd or 3rd centuries. But what I just gave you there, most scholars do think Josephus actually said. They also add that they think Josephus said that after Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that his disciples continued to follow him, and that the Christian movement still remains to this very day. But there are a number of us who would say that Josephus also said that his disciples reported that he appeared to them 3 days later. And I think there's good evidence that he said that. Not that he said he rose from the dead and appeared to them, but that they reported that he rose and appeared to them. So that would be one. The other would be Tacitus, a great Roman historian, perhaps one of the most accurate Roman historians. He writes in the early 2nd century, and he mentions how after the Pilate crucified Jesus, it says Christianity was thus checked for the moment, and then it broke out again in Judea, where the evil started and then spread even to the capital, Rome. What's interesting about that is entirely consistent. First, he calls Christianity a mischievous superstition and evil. So Tacitus is not a friendly source. He is not only unsympathetic, he's even kind of hostile toward Christianity. But he attests that after Jesus was crucified, Christianity was checked for the moment, and then it broke out again in Judea and then spread even to the capital. That's entirely consistent with what we find in the book of Acts and in the Gospels. It was checked for the moment, and then after he appeared to them, and after Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, you have Pentecost, and they're out proclaiming publicly Jesus' resurrection and the message of Jesus, and people are becoming followers of Jesus all over the place. And then the Great Commission to go out and spread the gospel, make disciples of all nations, and it gets even to Rome. So even though he doesn't mention the resurrection, what Tacitus says is entirely consistent with it.
Yeah, and that source is probably something akin to about World War II distance from when he was writing. World War II from us to here, and we still talk and write. And I mean, I had dinner tonight with my wife's grandfather who fought in World War II, 94 years old tomorrow. And so,
wow.
We're talking about a source that was not that far off in Tacitus. I mean, this is he could have known some people who possibly were even in the area, possibly. I mean, so early non-Christian sources. Okay, last question here, and then I'm gonna ask you a personal one to close. Help not, this comes from someone says, ask Mike please to help us non-math majors understand how Jesus rose on the 3rd day if he was crucified on a Friday and rose on a Sunday.
Oh, that's easy. So back then you've got, just like we have today, there are temporal figures of speech. If I were to say, hey, just give me, I'll help you in a minute. Well, I don't literally mean 60 seconds, it could be 10 minutes really. I'd say to my kids, hey, I need you to go, when they were young, go out and pull some weeds. Well, that'd take forever to do that in the front yard. Well, it wouldn't take forever. It might take 2 hours, something like that. So we use these temporal figures of speech. They used them back then. The 3-day motif was used in the Akkadian medical literature to suggest a short period of time. It was common to say, hey, you'll be okay in 3 days. That was just meant to say you'll be okay, you'll be healthy again in a short period of time, very soon. We find in the book of Esther, Esther tells her uncle Mordecai, when he comes up and he talks about Haman, he says, look, go back and tell the people to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And after that, after the 3 days and 3 nights, I will go in to the king and make the request. and it says they did as she requested. And then it says, on the third day, she went to the king. So you can see this is a temporal figure speech. You've got in the Gospel of Matthew, or just in all the Gospels in Paul, he was raised on the third day. He was raised after 3 days, things like this. And in Matthew, the Jewish leaders come to Jesus, or to Pilate, and they say, hey, we remember when this deceiver said that he would be raised after 3 days. So give us a guard until the third day, lest his disciples steal his body. Well, why are they just needed to the third day, and they're going to remove the guard after the third day when that's the time they need it most, because he's going to be raised after 3 days? Well, that makes no sense unless you understand the 3-day motif as a temporal figure of speech. One other thing. The Jews, the same as the Romans, and we can show this on the Roman calendar prior to the Julian calendar, they talked about days in an inclusive manner. So like at one point, Cicero in the 1st century BC is talking about a certain commotion that took place in the Roman Forum on the 23rd of January, but he doesn't say January 23rd. He says 8 days before the term eludes me right now, but it means the first of the month. So they would count back 8 days, but they're counting the first day of the month, and they're counting the 8th day back as well. So the Jews did this as well. So you got Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It just happens to be on the third day.
Give us, 50 great little resource here, 50 arguments for faith from the Bible, history, philosophy, and science, evidence for God. Great resource. Pick it up on Amazon. Of course, you've got longer work, but you've got the resurrection of Jesus here from Mike. We are, for those of you who ask questions, surprise, we're actually sending you, if you DM us any of your questions you submitted, we're actually sending you a Mike Licona book. So you just need to send us a little personal message, give us an address wherever you're hunkered down right now. We will put that in the mail to you. Thanks for being questionnaires. Books, a couple books. Give us a couple resources real quick that you would say, hey, on the resurrection, apologetics in general, just you got a couple of real quick sources that you'd say, hey, you ought to think about. If you haven't read much in this, you ought to think about picking this up.
Well, if you want a comprehensive case on the resurrection, grab my big book that you just looked at, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. You can get that on Amazon, christianbook.com, Abe Books, things like this. So if you're wanting more of a pretty simple version to get through, very practical, you can get the Case for the Resurrection of Jesus that Gary Habermas and I wrote together. If you want something, let's say just on basic apologetics, you could get any of Lee Strobel's books, of course, that are fantastic. You can get William Lane Craig's book. If you're really into the stuff, get his book, Reasonable Faith. If you're not into graduate level work in that, then you could get the light version of that called On Guard. There's so many great books out there right now. I hate to leave any out.
Yeah. My daughter, who is in the room here with us, when you mentioned Gary Habermas, she said he was that guy in the movie, The Case for Christ, which it was free up on Netflix or Amazon, one of the two, Amazon Prime, Netflix. A really good movie. I know a bunch of people from CSF went to watch it. Hey, Mike, let me leave you. So if you're not the reading type, which hopefully you are, but if you're not out there, you're going, hey, Case for Christ, actually really well done movie. But let me just leave you with this: the resurrection. Why, at a personal level, one of the titles we worked on tonight for this talk was exploring the resurrection. Did it really happen? Does it really matter? Why do you think the resurrection really matters? That there's a lot of things that are true, a lot of things we can study and explore and even believe in. I believe in there's oxygen in the air. I believe water is good to drink. These sorts of things. But why believe in the resurrection? What's the importance of it?
My mom died 7 years ago. My dad died 6 years ago, and I really miss them. And but when they died, the resurrection of Jesus came to have a whole deeper meaning to me. Before it was like, okay, this shows Christianity's true, and yes, it promises eternal life. The promise of eternal life is guaranteed because of the resurrection. But when my parents died, it took on a deeper meaning because, I just longed to see them. I miss them. And it's like, I know that they are with Christ in heaven right now. And it gave me great comfort. And, the Apostle Paul said, we do not grieve as those who have no hope, because we know that we're going to have eternal life. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. My dog, we had a dog for 16 and a half years, and she died a year ago. And I'll tell you, my wife will tell you, I wept more when my dog died than when both of my parents died combined. And it's not that I loved my dog more than my parents. It's because I have no guarantee I'm ever going to see that dog again. And to think of when I was holding that dog in my arms when they put her to sleep. And it's like one moment she's alive and it just been such a great family member. And it's like, I may never see this dog again. That just was devastating. And how much more if that's a family member? Now, if you haven't lost a family member, it's hard to conceive until this thing happens. And then you say, I am going to see them again. And that brings great hope. For those of you who are students and young at this point, what the resurrection means, like as we go through this coronavirus, so, you can be afraid that maybe you're going to get it and die, and you could. And it's like someone asked me today on an earlier program, well, what if we're afraid? What do you do in something like this? I said, well, look, maybe we're putting too much hope on earth and tied too much to this world. We need to be thinking about just serving God. We are here for his purpose, not for ours or to gain happiness for ourselves. And so if we die from the coronavirus, no big deal. We're going to heaven. So that's cool. Another thing, one final thing is God cares about you. He loves you. We can pray. When I was in college and grad school, I prayed every day. I fasted often. I wanted God to lead me to a good woman whom I would marry. And he did. I've been married. My wife and I just had our 33rd anniversary. And so he led me to a really good woman. And I'm so glad that I trusted him and prayed. But if Christ is raised, that means that we can have this relationship with God, and we can pray that God will lead us to a spouse, that he will lead us in our lives. Not everything's going to be great, and it's not meant to be that way. We live in a fallen world, but he does hear our prayers. And so there's really good reason to be tied in with God and to have that relationship with him. And the resurrection of Jesus shows that Christianity is true, and we can have that relationship with God.
That's beautiful, man. Mike Licona, it's so good to see you again, albeit from this digital distance. When we get Lewis House up and open, we want you up here. Just a perfect venue for you. And again, just so thankful for you just addressing tough questions here that people have about the resurrection, that especially as we head into Easter.